Hi, everyone. This is Rhonda Rawlings. I'm so honored to be here today at John Wesley United Methodist Church right here in Greenville with Pastor Daniel Hembree. How are you?
Fine, and yourself?
I'm doing great.
Good,
I'm doing great.
good.
Now, John Wesley is such a historic church here in Greenville.
Right.
You are the senior pastor.
Yes.
When did you first come to John Wesley?
I was appointed in 2021 after the annual conference of the United Methodist Church here in South Carolina, and I began Sunday, July 4th.
Oh, wow.
Independence Day. And so I'm going into my third year.
Wow,
at
so
John
you
Wesley.
just celebrated your anniversary.
Just celebrated that Sunday before last. Yes.
Wow, wow.
Yes.
So welcome to Greenville. So you're still fairly
Thank you.
new. You're still
new.
fairly new.
Yes.
We did discover right before our interview that we have something in common. I am from Mount Vernon, New York, and Pastor Hembree did an internship in Mount Vernon, New York,
right.
Which is so interesting because I think there you met Pastor Reverend Jesse Jackson, not pastor, but Reverend Jesse Jackson,
Yes.
who was actually from Greenville. I think at the time he was making his presidential run.
Well, when I met him, it was in 1992-93, so a few years after that.
Okay.
When I first saw him is when he made his presidential run. I was a student at Morehouse, but I met him personally at in 92 or 93
Awesome.
in Mount Vernon. Yes.
That's funny how things sort of go in circles, and
Yes,
here you
they
are
do.
now living in his hometown of Greenville, South Carolina.
Right.
So
right.
we are here in John Wesley United Methodist Church, which is a historic church, correct? Did you tell me it was 150 years old?
It'll be 157
Wow.
this fall.
Wow.
Yeah, we'll be celebrating our 157th anniversary.
Wow. Can you talk a little bit about the history of John Wesley?
Yes. Well, John Wesley, first, it's the oldest African-American church in Greenville,
Wow.
South Carolina. So that is significant in and of itself, but it began shortly after the Civil War. Not as John Wesley United Methodist Church, but as a Silver Hill Methodist Episcopal Church.
Okay.
And it was organized by a person we refer to as Father Roseman, Reverend Roseman, and he was a part of the Methodist Church at that time. And he, one of the things he did in this area was to plant several churches. I believe probably over 24, over 20 churches or so. And John Wesley is one of the seeds that he planted. And so it began, again, as I said, right after the Civil War, but some years prior to the Civil War, he had already begun organizing people. And I think it's significant because here we're talking about prior to the Civil War. So basically, we're still in that institution of slavery.
Right.
And yet you have these African-American men and women who have enough agency and efficacy to say that, no, we're going to continue coming together as a community to express ourselves spiritually and to do what we need to do in order to sustain ourselves within the context of this dehumanizing institution. And so the seeds, the antecedents of the church go back that far. And then after the Civil War, I guess around 1866, 67, the church began to, Reverend Roseman began to bring more structure to the church. And so that is actually how it began.
Wow.
And so that, I think that says a lot about who John Wesley is today in 2023.
That is an amazing history, and I think it really shows the strength of African American people, that they could come together to build a structure such as this at a time when they were wildly oppressed.
Right. The strength, the courage, and the faith that we could do this despite all of the obstacles against us, as you say, despite being in a context that sought to dehumanize them in every way possible, that they could still say, I am, as William Holmes Borders would say, I am somebody. And they did that. So I am proud and honored to be a part of this history, a part of this story, by standing as the pastor of this congregation and historical church.
Wow. Well, we thank you so much for that. And it is a beautiful church. I want to invite people to come to a service one Sunday and just sit in with you. You'll be sitting as a part of history and among a congregation that loves their pastor and loves their church. So I want to invite people to come out to John Wesley United Methodist Church. It is definitely a landmark in Greenville. When you say John Wesley, people know exactly what you're talking about.
That's right.
So I want to talk a little bit about your background. I'm going to look at my notes because it is extensive. So not only are you the senior pastor at John Wesley United Methodist Church, Pastor Hembree also currently serves as part-time assistant professor in pastoral care, counseling, and therapy at theological seminary at Allen University. Got a little tongue-tied there.
Okay. Yeah, I'm teaching at Dickerson Green Theological Seminary at Allen University in Columbia, South Carolina. I've been there since 2017, but not serving as a professor. I was serving as the project director for the Environmental Justice Institute. But when the seminary opened in the fall of 2018, Dr. McNeely, who was the president of Allen, actually invited me to come over and to become a part of the faculty of the seminary. But since that time now, I've also been appointed as dean of the Dickerson Green Theological Seminary too.
Oh wow! Congratulations!
So, thank you.
Congratulations.
So I'm wearing two hats. That one hat keeps me, I guess, grounded or centered in the academy, but the other hat keeps me grounded and centered in the church.
Oh wow! And was that a natural transition for you? The teaching part, because you are a scholar yourself. I mean, you are a graduate of Morehouse of the University of Michigan, Union Theological Seminary, as well as you have a doctorate from Northwestern.
Right.
So that's a lot of degrees.
Right.
Did teaching, did that come, was that a natural progression?
When I was a student at Morehouse, and although I didn't graduate, I was there long enough, I believe it was there that the seeds were planted, where I wanted to pursue higher education, hopefully with the hopes of teaching one day. Ministry was not on the radar at that time, maybe because I was so young and having too much fun that I just wasn't thinking I was there. I went to Morehouse, but it's interesting because while I was there, whatever club I was involved in, I would always ask to become the chaplain. And I remember a friend, colleague, a student said to me one day, I said, I want to be a chaplain. He said, well, you should be the chaplain because the Lord only listens to you. And I'm thinking, well, how would you figure that? How would you know that? So I believe that those seeds were planted while I was there. And I ended up transferring to the University of Michigan. At that time, I knew I wanted to go into higher education. But it was also at the time that I answered the call, if you will, to ministry. And so what I intended to do was two things. I wanted to have the PhD so I could teach, but I wanted to earn the Master of Divinity degree so I could also be connected to the church, because the pastor of my home church where I grew up in Detroit, he had one. He had a PhD. He pastored the church, but he also taught at Payne Theological Seminary. He was a graduate of Boston University, and I think the wedding of those two vocations or callings is something that has been a part of the African American community for a long time. And I saw myself, I believed that I was being called to do that as well. And so that's how that all started.
I love it. And so working in education as you do, what gives you optimism about our next generation of leaders?
Interesting question, because I started teaching at Claflin University, actually, in 2003. That's what brought me to South Carolina. And I served there for 9 years. But what gives me hope, what I find optimistic about our young students today, is a kind of fearlessness and courage that they have to go out and to pursue whatever it is that they believe that God has for them. And they do it with such a fearlessness that I don't believe many of us may have had or possessed in the past. And so I'm inspired and I'm encouraged by their strength, by their drive, by their ambition to change and transform the current landscape where they find themselves. We saw that even with, for example, the Black Lives Matter movement, that you had young people taking the helm, not asking for permission, not trying to get a particular pass in order to do it. They saw a need and they responded. They didn't react, they responded to it.
They forged ahead.
They forged ahead, and that's what we see with our young people, just continuously forging ahead. So I'm hopeful. Yes.
Awesome. That's great to hear from someone in education. So I think our young people really get a bad rap, and you hear a lot of negativity.
Right.
But from what I've seen, I see so many enterprising young people that are really charging ahead, with what they believe they're called to do.
Yeah, I think the entrepreneurial spirit burns bright inside of them now, that they are even graduating from college. If they've gone to college, some have not and decided to go a different route, but they said, we're not going to wait for somebody to come and offer something. We're going to go out and create something for ourselves. And this is what we grew up. I mean, I remember my parents said, you have to go out and do this, but times were different. And so I'm encouraged by the courage of our young sisters and brothers doing what they do.
Awesome. Well, as you know, we're interviewing you for Black History USA, and so I want to ask you if there's a particular civil rights figure in history that has touched you a little bit more personally, or that you look up to a little bit more.
I would say that's a good question, but a hard question because there are so many.
It's a hard question.
And to try to single out one, for me, it's somewhat difficult. There are three people in particular that I'm attracted to in terms of civil and human rights, and that is for what they said, how they lived, and what they tried to do. One was the late Fannie Lou Hamer of Mississippi, who was just sick and tired of being sick and tired, but the strength and the courage that she embodied and possessed to fight against racial injustice, oppression, segregation, is something to be admired. And I strongly admire her for that. Many times I'll play something on YouTube just to hear her speak. Wow. Because of the fire that was in her voice. To listen to her can encourage one to continue to fight despite what's happening in the world around us, especially at this time in America. And so I greatly admire Fannie, but there are two others that kind of bracket her, if you will. And one would be Dr. King. Of course, and probably many people admire Dr. King. But I look at Dr. King because he was both, although we don't talk about that much, he's an academic or an academician as well as a clergy person, but also he was one of the great civil rights leaders of this nation, and he embodied, if you will, I think the heart and the essence of what the Christian faith is about. Dr. King once said, you don't have to look to the other great, I don't have to look to the other great philosophers for inspiration and hope to do what I do. He said, I look at a little man from Galilee, and that's where I take my hope. And but yet that other side of Dr. King, which is not played up as much, and that is the King that was also a great scholar, a great thinker. We don't talk a lot about that. Maybe in academic context we do, but in terms of just the media and all, we just don't hear that part. So King, and the other person that brackets Fannie Lou, the three of them, I guess, is my strange kind of trinity, would be Malcolm X. Malcolm X, and although not of the Judeo-Christian faith, but yet and still, he too, like the others, embodied the heart, the essence, and the spirit of his faith. And all of them gave themselves, gave their lives because they believed in what they were doing and were willing to do it despite other things that was there. I mean, they had families and all, but they were out on the front line. And Malcolm, I remember listening to Ozzie Davis as he talked about Malcolm in a kind of eulogy, and he said, we referred to him as our black shining prince.
I remember that.
Because that's who he was, that's who he is. He was able to articulate what people were afraid to say, but were always thinking. And so I would say, instead of those three are three in particular that I draw strength and inspiration from.
I love that. One of the things I love so much about Malcolm X's story is he wasn't afraid to come back and say, I may have been wrong in certain areas. A lot of people don't, it's hard for them to say when they've had a change of heart, or say, you know what, I might have looked at this situation wrong. And I always think about that.
That's right.
With him.
He did. And to do that takes a great deal of courage. Yes. And humility. And Malcolm embodied that. That, as you say, he was not afraid to say, okay, I didn't see this right. Because again, you look at King and Fannie, they were young. Right. They were young. Malcolm was taken at 39, King was taken at 39, but when they did the work, they were even younger than that. And for Malcolm to be able to admit that I was wrong, I didn't see this right, so therefore I'm going to reposit this another way. Right. Took a great deal of courage and strength. Wow. And I admire him for that. Yeah. This
is a little kind of off subject, but I think, like, I love hearing these stories about, you know, our civil rights leaders, and I grew up with parents that were older. I think my parents didn't think they could have children, and then I popped up when my mom was 40 and my dad was almost 60. And so I just encourage people to talk to their parents and their grandparents about history. Like, my dad grew up in Harlem. He was born and raised in Harlem, New York, and would see Malcolm X, and he would always say, yeah, they called him Red.
That's right. Red.
And so it's just so amazing to me, the things that we can learn from our older generations. And I don't know that we take enough time to actually sit down and talk to you know, our grandparents about the times that they've lived through and the things that they've seen, because the stories are incredible. The stories are incredible.
That's true. I like you, I grew up with older parents. I thought my parents were the oldest parents in the neighborhood. And my mom, there was about 10 years between my mother and father. So like you, when I was born, mom was already near 40. And but we grew up in a house surrounded by books. And although they didn't get very far in school, they still believed highly in education. They valued education. And 3 books in particular were in our house. One was the original autobiography of Malcolm X. The other one was a book, Dr. King, Why We Can't Wait. and the other one was by Louis Lomax, When the Word is Given. And I saw these books as a part of my mom's collection of books in the house, and they never had a chance to meet Malcolm and Martin and them, but they talked about them. And my mother always said, well, you know, you went to hear Martin Luther King speak. I said, no, I didn't. She said, oh, yes, you did. She said he came to Detroit in 1962, and he spoke about the American dream. And she said, you were there. I said, how? She said, I pushed you down the street in a baby.
Were a toddler or
yeah,
right.
She said, I pushed you down the street in a stroller. So I heard him, though I didn't know it.
Right.
Yeah.
Wow.
But when you talk about spending time with our parents and grandparents and elders, I did a lot of that, but like you, I would encourage us to do more for those who still have them around.
Right, and I wish I would have done more, asked more questions. But yes, so I know that you have a very busy day. I do want to ask this one question. Like the last several years has been quite deep, quite a time for us here. I mean, we've had COVID, we've had the tragedy, the murder of George Floyd. And through all this, we had the Black Lives Matter movement. Through all this and after all this, of course, we're still going through a lot of this. But we've seen reports that church attendance is declining.
Right.
What are your thoughts on that? And talk about how important the Black church is in these times, because we know how important the Black church was, as you talked about, this church being built pretty much during the Civil War. Right. So talk about how important the Black church is during all times, but specifically during times of distress.
Yeah, the African American church has always been that place where we could find community, healing, transformation, and support. Historically, that is what the church came to be, living in a society, again, that devalued us, dehumanized us, that looked upon us simply as property, as shadow. The African American church was that one place where we could come and be reassured and affirmed that we were and we are God's people. And it was the place where we found community when we couldn't find community. And we could come there and be, capital B-E, to be. That is what the church historically had been, and it was the place that cared for the soul of our people. When we were living in a society that shot daggers and attempted to just pull us apart like the cross at Calvary pulls you apart. The church was the place where we could come and be put back together again. Reports show that even prior to the pandemic, membership in many churches was falling off anyway. My mother would call me from Detroit and say, you know, it just wasn't many people here today. And that was a few years prior to the pandemic. And then, of course, when COVID hit, then I've said to several persons, that was like the nail in the coffin then. Of course, we had to find alternative ways to worship, to grieve, to be together, to do all of that. I think one of the most disappointing things is having lost people, members during that time, and all we could do was go to a graveside and try to celebrate as best we could. My mother passed during that time, not from COVID, but from another illness, and yet we had to have a funeral at the funeral home. And I remember the pastor saying, he said, because my mother was 96 when she passed. She said, "This is not the way you send someone off at 96 in a funeral home, in a place that's cold and callous. We need to be in the church, but we can't."
Right.
And he called the sermon, her eulogy was Coronation for a Queen, because he said that's the best way he could do it, because of we had to be there. But COVID sent us home. And for those of us in pulpits across the nation, they put us on TV, so to speak. And many became stars in their own sense. And that, in a sense, is where we are today. So,
and I would say that people may have gotten into that sort of rut of staying home and feeling like it's more comfortable. But I think if they get back out and sit in the pews, they'll realize that there's nothing like the fellowship of believers.
There's nothing like the fellowship of believers, nothing like being with the body of Christ. Right. And when people come together, it brings about transformation, healing, support, all of the things that we used to experience are still there. And so, unfortunately, COVID did that. And when we came back, they didn't come back. So now we're all competing and trying to discover and find new ways of getting people back. But they should know that what they left is still here. It's still here, it hasn't gone anywhere. Right. We just need to come back now. And so that's been, I think it's problematic for many people across the nation. How do we get our members back? And not just in the church, but in other areas. Right. Our universities are struggling. You know, we can't get the students back because they had to go home.
Right.
And they were on Zoom, and we got comfortable again, and sometimes complacent. So we have a challenge in front of us, and I think it's going to force us to begin to create and discover new ways of being and worshiping together, as you say, as a fellowship of Christ, as the body of Christ.
Most definitely. Well, thank you so much for taking the time today. And
thank you.
You are doing great things, and we're so thankful to have you here in Greenville. And Black History USA wants to present you with the Black History USA Leadership Award for 2023, presented to Reverend Dr. Daniel T. Hembree. So congratulations on that.
Thank you. Thank you.
And we want to thank everyone for watching, and come back out to church and come visit John Wesley United Methodist Church. Thank you so much for watching.
Thank you.